Okay, I got my guy, John E. Lewis. He is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine and the founder of Dr. Lewis Nutrition. Dr. Lewis, welcome to the show, brother.
Hey, buddy. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, super excited to get into brain health and supplements and all things of that nature. But I'm just wondering, when I was looking at your background, you have this doctorate in behavioral sciences, and I'm thinking, what's a guy with a behavioral science degree talking about nutrition? Like, why does he care so much? And what does that have to do with brain health? Talk to me. How did this happen?
Great question. That's a loaded question. Well, I'm a physiologist by training, but I have a hybrid PhD that involved behavioral science, education, a little bit of psychology, a lot of statistics, a lot of research design curriculum. But really, if fundamentally, I like the body in terms of understanding how nutrition and exercise affect it. And so, in my view of the world, I think nutrition, if you just look at the magnitude and the amount of information at PubMed or whatever other depository you like going for looking for scientific information, to me, nutrition is up here. And then way down here is exercise at number two, and then everything else kind of falls below that. So I just going all the way back to like my days of being a drug-free competitive bodybuilder in college to today, where at some point in my journey, I shifted from more of a sports performance focus to now and has been for a long time, a health focus. I think, again, nutrition is your number one behavior, your number one lifestyle factor, whatever you want to call it. And so to me, that's just so crucial, to having really health is wealth. I mean, there's no truer saying. And so that starts with nutrition. That starts with what we put in our mouths, because everything that we put in our mouth is coded information on some level, whether it's good or bad. And so optimizing our health through nutrition and again, exercise and all these other things for me is just, that's been my calling for a long time. It will probably be the calling for my life till my last breath. But that's a very broad sort of view. I haven't really drilled down to any specifics yet, but for me, I think health is our most important characteristic in addition to the time that we have in this life. And we can not do anything about the passage of time, of course, but we can do a lot when it comes to protecting our health. And to me, that starts nutrition is health 101. So that's where I am today.
So for someone like you who's prioritizing, obviously health is wealth, you said it yourself. What do you do then to prioritize health to the fullest? Is it just optimizing nutrition? Is that like your core value that you make sure you hit on? Or what are you doing to prevent that aging and prevent and live as long as you can in the healthiest form?
Absolutely. So for me, diet is number one. I've been eating a whole food plant based diet now. This is my 26th year of doing that. But I am the
So no,
person
when you say whole food, plant-based, no, absolutely no meat.
none.
Wow. Okay. Dive into that and tell me why. We got carnivore, we got keto. Everyone's talking about this. This is all the rage right now, Dr.
I know.
John. So tell me what led you down to this path. And especially, you know better than anybody. You were a freaking bodybuilder. You need protein. You need lots of protein to make muscles. So yeah, talk to us about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting journey. So I grew up in the South. I grew up in Tennessee, where my family ate for taste, not for health. I didn't have any person in my family who was kind of a mentor or a model or somebody that I could look up to as in a health context. It was just eating for what tasted good. And so in that respect, my dad, he thought eating beef at every meal was a meal. I mean, if it didn't have some form of beef in it, it wasn't really a meal. And even a glass of milk. I mean, those were the kinds of things that I grew up in where, again, I just accepted it because that's what my parents did, my grandparents, all of my other family. So I didn't really know any different. And even getting into school, like I mean, to your point about protein, of course, as a bodybuilder, I thought, well, I need a lot of protein or I'm not going to grow and I'm not going to repair myself, which was, it was and still is true to some degree. But I think, again, as I mentioned over time, I shifted from a sports performance orientation to a health orientation. And I'll never forget back in 1999, one of my childhood friends introduced me to a guy by the name of Robert Cohen, who at that time was sending out a daily listserv, and it was called Not Milk. And it was very profound to me. I started reading this guy's website, notmilk.com. It's still alive today, still going, even though he no longer does his listserv. But I started reading all this information that Robert had compiled there, and I thought, wow, why have I never heard this before? I mean, it was really fascinating looking at all these articles about the the negative effects of consuming cow's breast fluid on human health. I never heard of any of this before. I mean, I don't know about you. I grew up going to school from first to 12th grade in public education or in public schools. I never had anything of what I would consider to be substantial information about nutrition or health. But looking back on it, what little I did have was basically dairy industry propaganda. And when you look at, this notion of humans needing cow's breast fluid to be healthy, it's nonsense. I mean, on so many levels, it's nonsense. And so that was kind of like my first introduction to considering how really, truly powerful food is for us. And at that point, I mean, I'd even given up mostly red beef or red meat at that time, mostly beef. Never was much of a pork eater. If we didn't eat beef, I would eat chicken maybe or turkey. And of course, in Tennessee, you're not really going to be that much into seafood, at least not most of us. And we weren't fishermen, so we didn't really, go to the lake and eat catfish or bass or any of that stuff either. But again, and this didn't happen like just overnight. This was a slow burn, so to speak. But over time, as I continued reading more and more information about the benefits of plants versus the detriments of eating all this animal tissue, I just decided, well, I'm going to change. I'm going to try it. And that was, again, 26 years ago. And that's where I've been. It took me, I would say, over about a 6-month period of first eliminating the dairy. As I mentioned, I'd pretty much already stopped eating beef at that point. So if, eating beef a couple of times a year to eliminate that was no big deal. I never ate pork, so that wasn't anything to give up. And fish, I mean, as a bodybuilder, sometimes I'd eat a can of tuna just out of convenience because it was quick and easy and convenient. But other than that, I wasn't much of a fish eater. The only thing that I really figured, or that took me a bit of an adjustment to, was giving up eggs. I did eat a lot of eggs, but over time, I gave those up as well. So again, this was over probably a 6, 7, 8 month period where I chose to eliminate animal food, and that's who I've been ever since. I mean, I think, again, to your point of this rising interest in keto over the last decade or so, and then more recently carnivore, which I don't know, I'm sorry, it just totally doesn't make any sense to me that human beings should only eat animal tissue for sustenance. I mean, I think we have the capacity to eat anything we want, and our body it has its own inherent intelligence to be able to accommodate to that style of eating. But to me, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the most optimal way to eat. And so I think one of the things that we all struggle with looking at nutritional science is, how do you make sense of it all? I mean, you've got all these people like Colin Campbell and Caldwell Esselstyn that have written articles and books about a plant-based diet, Joel Furman, Michael Greger, all these people. And then you've got people on the carnivore keto side that are writing similar books and similar articles, and they're saying basically the exact opposite thing. So to me, I think it just comes down to, how do you view the world? I mean, what do you think makes sense to you? The way I make sense of nutritional information is I look at it in several different levels. So first of all, conducting clinical trials on human beings for a lifetime is not going to happen, right? I mean, there is no possible way we're going to enroll a group of people at birth, feed them a prescribed diet for their entire lives, follow them that whole time, and then see what happens. Can you imagine the difficulty in running a trial like that? It's not going to happen. It never will happen. So the best we can do is take information from observational studies. Some of the best ones would be, of course, like Framingham. That's been going on since the 1950s, looking at different factors, not only about nutrition, but physical activity and other behavioral things related to mostly cardiovascular disease. But I think they've gotten more recently into other things too, of course. So that's a very rich source of observational information. You have NHANES from the CDC, if we can believe CDC anymore these days. I mean, I think they've lost a lot of credibility recently. But NHANES, nonetheless, has been collecting information, again, for decades on people, mostly related to their nutritional behaviors, but others as well. Then you have the Seventh-day Adventists at Loma Linda. They've been collecting their information for decades now as well. So there are these large observational studies where you look at what happens to people over time. It's no intervention, but it's observing them, and you're trying to make conclusions based on the behaviors that they're reporting and what's being drawn out of their blood and their urine, and then looking at that from a correlational perspective. Again, is that a perfect way to get answers? No, but there is no such thing as perfect science. And anybody who tries to argue with me otherwise, I'm just going to tell you, I'm sorry, I don't agree with you. So you have large groups of observational data. Then you have data like from my experience where I ran clinical trials in people in short periods of time, typically, well, in our research, up to a year. I mean, if you try to go with human beings more than about a year or two, again, that's very expensive work. It's very time consuming work. And, it's just difficult to engage people for that long and do it in a way that ultimately, at the end of the day, that you can make sense out of. And then, of course, the third level of information is what you can gather from running short-term studies on cells, tissues, and animals. But again, that's limited. I mean, how much information is actually directly translatable from what you find in a mouse or a rat or a rabbit or even a dog or a monkey, and then applying that information to a human? I mean, you can kind of get there, but again, you have limitations because even though we're all mammals, we have different enzymes, we have different metabolic pathways. So there are different things that go on in between different species of mammals. But with all of those limitations, given, and if you can accept those with an open mind, you take what goes on at the observational level and, again, large numbers of people, thousands of people over decades of time, combined with smaller clinical trials in people in a shorter period of time, combined with what you can demonstrate in cells and tissues and animals, and then you try to put that all together and make sense of it. And in my opinion, again, this is my opinion. I'm not here to convince anybody. I'm not preaching. I don't do that. If somebody comes to me and asks me for information about nutrition, I'm going to share with you what I know to be true for myself and what I believe. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to sit here and pound my gavel and say I'm right and you're wrong and the heck with you. But anyway, if you look at all those levels of information combined, to me, in my opinion, I believe the majority of that information will speak more to the benefit of a plant-based diet than it will to the benefit of a carnivore or keto diet. I mean, that's just my view of the data on that level. I mean, if for example, you look at, again, I mean, the Seventh-day Adventists, I mean, most of those people from their religious perspective, they're mostly vegetarian, right? So they have, based on their data over decades of information, they show lower risks of heart disease, lower risks of different types of cancer, lower risk of type 2 diabetes, obesity, and longer lifespan. So, that's one level of information. Then you look at, again, short-term clinical trials. I mean, Caldwell Esselstyn, the cardiologist from the Cleveland Clinic, he's got some really nice data short-term in putting people on a plant-based diet, even a very low-fat to no-fat diet, and being able to reverse atherosclerosis. I mean, that's pretty profound. And that's not just him speculating. He's actually got images of showing reversals of atherosclerosis in people who adhere to this pretty strict plant-based diet. And then, of course, in things like at the cellular or tissue level, well, you have to look at, introducing, say, what would be a good example? Like, say, for example, I was just reading a study about extra virgin olive oil and how it actually affects different types of genes in PBMCs. And so looking at how a certain level of phenols, which, again, this goes along with the people who advocate for a lot of fat in the diet. And I think most people would say that extra virgin olive oil is a good source of fat. I don't know that too many people would be opposed to that from the carnivore or keto perspective, although I'm sure there are probably some out there that do. But anyway, showing that how that type of fat lowers inflammation and actually turns on genes that are good for preventing atherosclerosis and inflammation. So, I mean, when you combine things together like that, you can kind of start picturing together again pieces of information about how a plant-based diet could be beneficial for people. Now, you made the point about protein. I mean, to me, my opinion on protein, again, it's my opinion, but I think people are actually, certainly in the United States. I mean, maybe we could go to third world countries in Africa or Central or South America to be a different story. But quite frankly, I don't know anyone in my life who's protein deficient. Do you? I mean, just eating your typical standard American diet, people are getting enough protein. And in fact, only the people like me who I'm not competitive in bodybuilding anymore, although I still lift every day, I'm still very active. But I don't think, unless you're some really extreme bodybuilders, power lifter, strength training athlete, or you have HIV, or you have serious burns, in another case where you're wasting, you have very sufficient or a deficiency in wasting, those people need more protein, clearly. But for the average American who's just sitting on his butt all day and needs to just, gorge himself on protein, I don't understand that. I mean, again, looking at some of the information out there, high protein diets have been linked to things like kidney issues, bone issues, liver issues. So, it's not just like, oh, well, all this protein is good for us. No, it's actually been shown in other studies that if you eat too much protein, you could be causing yourself some benefit, or I'm sorry, some detriment down the road. So it's just not like, it's not one or the other. I mean, you can't just say, oh, well, you're eating all these carbs, it's bad for you. No, that's not true. I mean, there's plenty of information that shows that's not the case. To me, it just comes down to, it reminds me of one of my old professors in grad school said he was one of the first people at the University of Florida doing experiments on what became Gatorade. And I don't know how familiar you are with the Gatorade story, but when they initially created that formula, it tasted like garbage. It was so nasty that the only people that would drink it were the athletes at the University of Florida who were, whether they were football players, basketball, whatever, and they were in practice. And so when you're, dehydrated and you're so thirsty, you'll drink anything because your sensation of taste gets blunted because the body wants to rehydrate itself. But the formula that they were using that actually showed some benefit for those athletes at the University of Florida was not sellable. It tasted like garbage. So they ended up having to sweeten it to a degree that it wasn't even the same formula that they originally, were doing these tests on their athletes with. So Dr. Welch's point to all that was, sometimes a product ends up on the shelf that is not even close to what it was initially or what it was tested on. And so marketing typically is up here and science is down here. So my point is, with all these people that are just ranting and raving about keto and carnivore right now, yeah, may be true to some degree in terms of your short-term benefits on weight loss. I mean, I think of anybody that's morbidly obese and you're struggling to try to come up with some strategy to be able to lose weight and get healthier, fine, go into ketosis and lose weight and, enjoy that short-term benefit. But, somebody from that world show me, again, the same thing from like the perspective of the work that's been done in Framingham or with the 7-Day Adventists. Show me data from, following people 10, 20, 30 years, following a keto carnivore diet, how healthy that is. There's no information about that. So to me, all these people right now speculating about how it's the way to eat, they're doing so without having any idea of what the 10, 20, 30 year down the road result of that is.
Yeah, great stuff. And I think, you highlighted it from the beginning. It's based on that bio-individuality, and everybody is going to react differently. I also think you're right. There's not enough data to suggest carnivore and keto is optimal long-term. We just don't know. And
no information.
Yeah, there's just not enough. There's some short-term studies, but it's just not enough. So great stuff. And speaking of peer-reviewed studies, you've done 180 of your own. I'm curious, what were some of the most surprising things you learned from your research and what you've published at your time at University of School of Medicine at Miami?
Well, thank you, thank you for that. Yes, I'm very proud of my academic track record. I mean, even though I left full time 6 years ago, I'm now voluntary faculty. But I spent a lot of years there in the trenches running clinical trials and making some really key discoveries along the way that I think, would hopefully be of interest to at least some of your listeners, where we looked at these particular polysaccharides on people with Alzheimer's disease and multiple sclerosis. So, those being two of the three big neurodegenerative disorders today, the Parkinson's being the third one, where basically from a conventional medical perspective, these folks really have very limited options. But we showed in response to this polysaccharide formulation that there were tremendous benefits that were gained from these. So we ran these clinical trials and published some really exciting papers. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of those studies if you'd like me to. But in terms of like just my overall career to date, I think what we published from the Alzheimer's and to a lesser degree, the MS study, I think were probably the highlights of my academic career so far. I mean, in terms of just, again, demonstrating that nutrition actually could be something that could help people with, from a conventional perspective, really little, to be able to help people actually, for example, in the context of having Alzheimer's, and these were people with, they had to be diagnosed for at least 1 year, and they were at the moderate to severe severity level. So we're talking about really impaired people. And oh, by the way, they were 79.9 years of age on average. So these were very old folks. And they didn't just have Alzheimer's disease. They had, other things like depression, diabetes, different types of heart disease. So these were very sick and impaired people. And we put them on this allopolysaccharide complex. And at the end of 12 months, so we did the neuropsych testing at baseline, 3, 6, 9, and 12 months, and then we drew blood at baseline and 12 months. At 9 and 12 months, we showed clinically and statistically significant improvements in cognitive function. I mean, Joel, it blew us away. We were optimistic going into the trial that, hopefully this formula would help people, but we had no idea to the level. And so according to the ADAS-Cog, which is considered to be the gold standard of assessing cognition, particularly in dementia studies, to get, and remember, I'm very specific about this, clinically and statistically significant improvement. So not only, you can get, if you have hundreds or thousands of subjects in a study, it's very easy to get something statistically significant. But does that really mean anything on the clinical or practical level in terms of helping somebody with their health? And so to actually have that clinically significant improvement, for us, that was just like, again, if you've had any family members or anyone with Alzheimer's or dementia, what a tragic
Yeah, I know quite
disease
a few.
is. Well, there you go. So I don't have to explain it to you. And so how tragic this disease is, and the fact that, it's now the 6th leading killer of Americans. I mean, we're spending I think it's now about 6 million people who are estimated to have Alzheimer's, and then another 8 or so million who have other forms of dementia. So we're talking, roughly 14 million people out of a population of 330 million. Not really a huge number of people by percentage, but in terms of the cost, I mean, we're spending now like close to $1 trillion. It's estimated close to $1 trillion per year between formal and informal costs. And of course, the informal is due to, all the things that go on at home. But I mean, we're talking about just an incredibly expensive disease on a financial level, and then a completely devastating disease on a human level. That, again, all this money, that's billions of dollars that have been spent by Big Pharma, by NIH, all these, different organizations and groups spending billions of dollars looking for the solution in drugs or genes. And then meanwhile, we actually showed something with nutrition that, in my opinion, without sounding like, too much of an egomaniac, was basically better than, anything else that's ever been shown or discovered. So in addition to the cognitive function side, looking at the biomarkers, we showed improvements in TNF alpha and VEGF, our paper was probably the first one to publish that in people with Alzheimer's. Those markers have classically been looked at in cancer and heart disease. So we showed a nice lowering of those two inflammatory markers. We showed an improvement in the CD4 to CD8 ratio, which is very important, not just for people with Alzheimer's or even people with HIV. For all of us, as we age, we want that helper ratio to cytotoxic ratio to be as good as possible, as high as possible. So we actually showed an elevation in that. That was a very nice finding. And then we also showed an increase just under 300% of adult stem cells according to the CD14 cells. So when you put all these things together, I mean, it was just such a beautiful picture. You have this nice cognitive improvement on the clinical side combined with all this stuff going on, physiologically. And when you put it all together, for us, it was a really pretty picture in the sense of what's the only thing that could explain clinical improvement? Well, with lowering of the inflammation combined with increasing the adult stem cell production, what our theory is in the discussion section of that first paper is that the stem cells migrated out to the brain to either, create new neurons, new synapses, repair damage, do all the above, because we didn't have imaging. We didn't have enough money for imaging to be done in this study. And I don't even know 15 years ago how good the imaging could have been at that time. But just looking at it from how it makes sense to us. I mean, why in the world would these people have actually started coming back to life? I mean, I had caregivers in the middle of the study calling me up saying, "Oh, Dr. Lewis," in tears of joy, saying, "My loved one is now doing things that he or she hasn't done in some cases in years." So, I mean, it was just such a profound experience running that trial and then publishing. Now we've had 3 papers we've published from that study. We actually have a 4th paper that's currently under review, and I'll just share that one with you briefly, even though it's not published yet. But I had an idea to look at the different components of the immune system. So I looked at the Th1 to Th2 ratios, which 1 and 2 are the most commonly studied and probably the most studied components of the immune system to this point. But it's not been studied at all in Alzheimer's. I mean, I looked for hours on PubMed. I had one of our co-authors look for this information on PubMed. We couldn't find it. It had never been characterized before in people with Alzheimer's disease. And so we looked at the Th1 to Th2 ratios in that sample. And then we had another study of healthy people where we looked at the same markers, these different cytokines and growth factors. Joe, when you look at the difference, I mean, the numbers are staggering. Like, they're so Th1 dominant, and you say, wow, oh my God, like, no wonder these people are so sick, or at least, partially. So we have this very extreme difference between people with Alzheimer's and healthy people. We show that for the first time. Then we show a rebalancing of these ratios over the 12-month period in response to our dietary supplement for the first time. And then the cherry on the cake is that we show actually as the Th1 to Th2 ratio gets rebalanced, not to unity, but certainly, heading that way, it's correlated with an improvement in cognitive function. I mean, what a brilliant, beautiful finding. So we're going to characterize this for the first time in people with Alzheimer's disease, and it kind of helps to really continue painting the picture how the immune system and the neurological system are so inherently linked. And what I like to tell people when I give lectures about this stuff is, to me, the immune system is way more important than our first line of defense against infection. I mean, I think since COVID, people have a lot more appreciation for how important our immune system is. But when you look at how the immune system really functions with the other organ systems, it's kind of like the conductor of the orchestra. And so you've got to have a balanced, surveillant, modulated immune system. Otherwise, you cannot possibly expect, your brain, your liver, your muscles, your heart, your bones, your kidneys, the rest of your endocrine system. You can't expect any of those other major organ systems to be functioning optimally if your immune system is not. So to me, this is, again, helping us to paint this picture of how beautifully these 2 major organ systems work together, and the balance between the 2 is just so important. And so when you think of brain health and all the things that are going on today, whether it's, autism and ADHD and children issues, and then through, young adulthood into older adulthood, where you have, people playing sports and having head injuries now today. I mean, concussion syndrome seems to be just out of control. Then, of course, you have people in the military having TBI and PTSD, all these wounds and injuries related to being in combat. And then, of course, we have, I think, just a staggering number of people with mood disorder today. Depression is like the number 2 disabler of employees. So I think cardiovascular disease is still number 1, but depression is now number 2. And then, of course, as we get into our older years, we have all this neurodegeneration going on. So literally from nearly cradle to grave, there's something related to the brain that's gone wrong seriously in our society. I mean, it's just staggering when you look at all these different things. And so being able to feed the brain properly with nutrition, to me, in my world, is no different than feeding properly your heart, your liver, your kidneys, your bones, your muscles, again, every other major organ system. It's just, for whatever weird reason, I think our research priorities as a society were not really too clear about the brain. And I guess there are still so many mysteries about the brain we don't completely understand or fully appreciate. But the brain, it doesn't operate in a bubble. I mean, it still needs nutrition. It still needs to be fed properly, just like every other major organ system. So it's been an interesting ride going down this path. And I think, in my career going forward, and hopefully for the rest of my life, focusing on health in general, but really helping people with all these brain related issues, to me, is just so important. And that's what I'm going to continue doing, again, as I said, for the rest of my life and career.
Yeah, that's great. Dr. John, quickly explain what the heck is a polysaccharide and how does this polysaccharide do anything to your body? Like, what is it doing? Is it like a, is it sending, is it like a cell signaling response? So what the heck is a polysaccharide and what is it doing to the body and why is it healing the brain?
I love it. I love it. Thank you, Joe, for that question. So polysaccharides, I'm sure, again, for the carnivore and the keto crowd, anything, if you say the word carbohydrate or sugar, that's a bad word to those folks. But again, we're talking about a polysaccharide being a complex sugar. So you have monosaccharides, very simple sugars, disaccharides being a little more complex, and then poly or oligosaccharides being the most complex. And simply, we're just talking about a difference in their molecular chains or their structures. And so, for those of you who think that carbohydrates are bad, I get it. If you're talking about high fructose corn syrup, that's definitely something that we all want to avoid. And if it's on an ingredient list on a package you're considering buying, by all means, put that thing back on the shelf. But polysaccharides, Joel, are so different from, again, these more simpler sugars like high fructose corn syrup. And in particular, in the work that we've done at the University of Miami, we focused on two, which I think, in my view, are very, very important, if not the most important. The one that comes from aloe is called, again, it's got several different synonyms: mannose, ace-mannan, acetylated polysaccharide. They all mean the same thing, but it's this polysaccharide that comes from aloe vera gel, the inner leaf gel. And then the second one is from rice bran. And then, when you think about rice, obviously much of the world eats rice every day, but unfortunately most people want to eat white rice. And so when the rice is brought in from the field and then it's milled and processed, when the kernel is stripped, when that outer shell is stripped off, leaving that last bit of that white layer, what got stripped off was the rice bran. And a lot of that rice bran ends up getting fed to livestock, actually. So livestock is actually eating the most beneficial part of that plant. But these polysaccharides, again, are very, very unique and very special. So if you are the kind of person who prefers to eat keto or carnivore or mostly an animal-based diet, don't get thrown off by the fact that all you need is a few hundred milligrams, maybe at most, if depending if you have like late-stage cancer or Alzheimer's or very serious heart disease or something, you might need a few grams. So we're not talking about possibly being able to disrupt your ketosis or any other part of your strategy about eating high protein and high fat. If you're only talking about adding just a few hundred milligrams to maybe a couple of hundred grams, 2 grams, not a couple of hundred, a few hundred milligrams to maybe 2 or 3 grams per day in your diet. When you're talking about somebody eating 2,000 or 3,000 calories per day, whatever someone's eating, that's obviously several hundred grams of whatever macronutrient. But again, these particular polysaccharides that come from aloe vera and rice bran are so biodynamically important to us. And to your point, or to your question about what is it that they do. So again, going back to some of the work that we've published, and this isn't just from our lab at the University of Miami, this is from other people around the world as well. We know that in general, what you could think of these polysaccharides in terms of a classification is that they are immunomodulators. What do I mean by that? Well, basically, we're talking about the capacity to lower inflammation, enhance overall immune function, which can be, obviously looked at in many different ways, depending on which markers you're looking at. And then, as we showed in the Alzheimer's study, being able to turn on or increase that stem cell production process. So there are just lots of different things here directly related to the immune system. But in addition to that, they also have been shown to be antioxidative. So they're very important for keeping oxidative stress down, which obviously, along with inflammation, is a hallmark of aging and something that we want to try to keep as low as possible. They also are very crucial for keeping proliferation down. So one of the things that is in terms of like contribution to cancer or heart disease is you have an overproliferation of these cells that create ultimately whether it's a tumor or something else like damage in the heart that has to be cleared or maybe a stent in place. But keeping that proliferation process down, that's obviously very important. In the case of aloe vera, not so much for rice bran, but certainly wound healing. And typically, anytime I say aloe vera, people think of aloe vera as a topical application, which is fine. If you have a cut or a wound or a sunburn. Obviously, putting, some gel on your skin is very important. But that's really a very limited view of aloe vera in terms of what we now know with eating it, and consuming it in a concentrated form in this powder that's a polysaccharide from the gel itself. That's way more beneficial than just applying some gel on your skin for, again, some kind of a cut or a wound or a sunburn. So there are lots of different mechanisms of actions that have now been attributed to these polysaccharides. And again, you do yourself a disservice by not thinking about adding these to your diet, even if, again, it's just a couple of grams per day that is not going to in any way interfere with your, strategy of high protein or high fat or both, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And what was interesting to me is that you got these blockbuster results. Anytime I think about MS or Alzheimer's, what I always think about is that there's probably a toxin in the body that's creating a deficiency, and that's where these people end up. And so my approach would actually be thinking, hey, let's remove the toxin that's creating this deficiency and then replenish the body with good nutrition like you're doing. But without even removing toxins, letting people just live their normal life, all you did is introduce this supplement and they're getting better. So that's pretty fascinating.
That is. And by the way, I should mention in our formulation, so it's, with nutrition, as you know, I like to use the analogy of a shotgun versus a sniper rifle. So for nutrition, it's a shotgun, like you're spreading, hundreds, if not thousands of nutrients, phytonutrients, vitamins, minerals, cofactors, metabolites, elements. You're giving all these things all at once to the body because the cell needs all these things simultaneously to function properly, compared to the big pharma model where they're typically testing, one chemical or one synthetic for one mechanism of action for one symptom of a disease. So very, very different paradigms here. And to your point about detoxification, we actually have in our formula, it's called Ultra Terra clay. It comes from a very deep lake in Mississippi where this clay is a very potent chelator of things like arsenic, heavy metals, PCBs, PFAs, all these things. So while on one level, we're providing the nutrition that the body needs, on the other hand, we're also chelating out some of this other bad stuff. But to your point in the study, again, I think what was so encouraging for us was that we just simply introduced this supplement into the life of these folks. We didn't change their diet. We didn't exercise them. We didn't socialize them. We didn't, try to improve their sleep. We didn't do anything else. We just simply added this supplement into their daily regimen. And so it's not even a functional medicine approach, from that perspective where you're trying to be very holistic. It was just simply adding this dietary supplement into the daily routine.
Yeah, very cool. Also, you mentioned some other things, ADHD, concussions, TBI, depression. Have you seen anecdotally, or are there studies also to show, hey, introducing this supplement, which I believe is called Brain Health, is that correct?
Daily Brain Care.
Okay, so we'll talk about that in a second. But just by introducing this supplement, have people giving you feedback, hey, my kid's ADHD has gone away or reduced, concussions, TBIs, etc. The healing process has, improved. Anything like that?
Absolutely. So, unfortunately, as I mentioned, we've only had the funding to run the clinical trials in Alzheimer's and MS. But yes, absolutely, anecdotally, everything from, again, attentional issues in children to people with all sorts of different traumatic injuries, veterans, people that have come back from military combat and been dealing with different types of TBI, PTSD related issues. Mood disorder, definitely. We've had a lot of people over the years with either depression or anxiety or both, some form of bipolarism helped there. Definitely people with Parkinson's as well. There have been quite a few people with Parkinson's who have had an interesting and nice response to the formulation. So yes, as I had mentioned earlier, with all these different things going on in society today related to the brain, and then having, different experiences with folks over time show positive responses. It's very encouraging for me to know if and when I actually had the funding to run more clinical trials in some of these different areas, I feel pretty confident that we would show, benefit and positive results. It's just, again, running clinical trials is very expensive, and I haven't had the funding to be able to do it in some of these other conditions. But I do feel optimistic that the clinical trials would prove out what we're seeing and showing anecdotally.
Yeah, great stuff. And then let's talk about the supplement, your supplement line, and just some of the most popular products that people are buying, and specifically this one that has all these studies regarding brain health.
Sure, thank you. Well, I appreciate that. So, daily brain care is the genesis or the result of all this work that we've done, and people can find it on my website, drlewisnutrition.com. But Joel, I'm very proud of this formula. I mean, obviously people in our industry get a lot of I guess you could say ill will or bad feelings about people selling supplements. There's just so much information going back and forth about what's good, what's not, what's bogus, what's legitimate. It's just you never know if somebody's a really good marketer versus if it's something that's actually going to work. And I tell everybody that I get a chance to interact with. I mean, I've been taking my own formula for 10 years. I've had my mother on it for 15. My wife's been on it the last 2. We have a 3-year-old daughter. I started her on it when she was 6 months of age. She just turned 3 back in March, and she's the healthiest, fittest little girl you've ever met in your life. But for me, like everybody should be taking this simply because, again, I don't care if you're vegan or carnivore or keto or whatever else your dietary philosophy is. You're not eating aloe vera. And if you're eating brown rice every day, you'll be getting a little bit of these polysaccharides, but not enough to what I consider to be a therapeutic benefit. So just adding, this powder, a couple of grams every day to your daily routine is just so beneficial. But I wouldn't sell anything that I don't take for myself. And I don't talk about, health promoting strategies or behaviors to other people that I don't do for myself. If I did, I'd be the biggest hypocrite in the world. And so I feel like, being in the trenches in clinical trials for 20 years almost and running these studies and publishing the articles and really trying to be as big of an open book as I can to the world about what we showed in the lab and how that relates to human health. To me, that's just very important. And I know there are other really good companies out there doing that too, but I feel like there's a standard that should be held. You as a person, if you just have any orientation about ethics and morality, you ought to want to sell things that you take yourself and that you stand behind. And so for me, that's a very important philosophy to have in business. And again, I wouldn't sell anything that I don't take for myself. And then there are other things that I do take that we don't sell. I mean, you asked me about maybe my top 5 would be besides daily brain care. Well, I think vitamin D is very important. We have
Well,
a
actually, Dr.
population of
John,
people that are
I want
either insufficient or deficient in vitamin D. We know vitamin D interacts with, I think it's something like 3,000 genes at this point. It's way beyond just bone health. I mean, it's so important for basically every organ system in our body. So I think, for those of you who don't get out in the sun much every day, and certainly us here in Florida, I mean, we have no excuse. So, we can always get some sun exposure in sunny South Florida. But if you're not getting sun every day, by all means, take vitamin D. I mean, it's cheap. It's not, it shouldn't be a financial concern for most people. Take your vitamin D. I mean, you can do yourself such benefit by taking vitamin D every day. So for me, that's definitely a no-brainer. Magnesium is another one. I mean, I think magnesium is so important. People are not getting enough magnesium. And again, much like vitamin D, magnesium has been shown to be not maybe as interactive with as many genes as vitamin D yet. But, again, I think over time, we will learn more about how magnesium is so important. But we definitely, much like vitamin D, we have a population of magnesium deficient people. Curcumin, I think, is an amazing phytonutrient. Again, with curcumin, you have to pay attention to how it's formulated because, unfortunately, just if you took the turmeric root and ground it up and ate that, you're going to get very little of the curcuminoids. The body rapidly metabolizes it, so you have to get it in a liposome or a micelle or some other kind of encapsulation where the body can actually absorb it and get it out into the bloodstream to be able to utilize it. But definitely curcumin is a go-to in my opinion. And then I would say, vitamin C classically, I mean, you look at going all the way back to all of Linus Pauling's work with vitamin C and showing how important vitamin C is. I mean, to me, it's definitely a no-brainer, especially if you're not eating much.
no brainer, no pun intended.
No pun intended, exactly. I think vitamin C is definitely very important as well. And then, I don't know, maybe for number 5, I guess kind of depending to your point of individuality, I try to do as much as I can. I don't do a lot of one-on-one work with people that much because it's so time consuming. But when I do, I try to, definitely individualize recommendations as much as possible. But I think a lot of people would benefit from a probiotic. And I know that the studies are just kind of all over the board out there on probiotics, simply because, different companies are using different strains. And so depending on not just that one strain, but then the combination of different strains, sometimes it's very difficult to make sense of all the different messages that are coming out about probiotics. But the fascinating thing to me, Joel, about probiotics is it's so true about our gut being our second brain, and how, for example, our neurotransmitters they're mostly formed in our gut, not in our brain, like serotonin, dopamine. I mean, these are actually mostly made in our gut, not in the brain. So, this whole notion of our second brain is the gut, and it's so true. And so feeding your gut properly, and putting in probiotics into the diet, if you're not eating much, say kimchi or sauerkraut, some fermented foods that would do that job, but put some probiotics into your diet. And oh, by the way, actually, the polysaccharides also function as a prebiotic as well. So they actually help to promote gut health as well. So that's one more mechanism of action that actually I just came to mind as I was thinking.
It's so funny you said that, because as you were talking about the aloe and the rice bran, that's exactly what I thought it was, a prebiotic, and that is the gut brain axis.
They function on that level as well.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, man. That's amazing. I want to wrap things up with you, but before I do, is there anything else that I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
No, I would I just like to say that, again, for those of you, I'm not here to argue with anybody. I'm not interested in arguments. I've dealt with too many arguments in my life over personal and professional things. I don't want to argue with people. Just be open-minded about the idea that polysaccharides could actually be beneficial to your health. I'm not using the bad word sugar here. I'm saying sugars are not sugars. And so these two particular...
And Dr. John, to cut you off, like my naturopath mentor taught me, like, from the beginning of time, like, the brain runs on glucose. So let's stop talking about, like, the primary fuel for the brain is glucose, not ketones.
That's right.
Can it run on ketones? Of course. So let's just put that all that to debate. So I think after just listening to this episode, everyone's going to understand the importance of these polysaccharides. And for me, I'm all about results. So you've got the results. So you're telling me if all I do is take this, and I'm going to have a better function, whether in aging, the brain, there's clearly something going on with the balance of the immune system. And so there's some good things. So, I mean, to your note, I mean, I'm all about results. I'm not here to argue. Either take Dr. John supplement or don't. Like, you're going to have a beautiful life either way. You might even have a better one if you have an open mind, right?
That's right. Amen to that, brother.
Yeah. I want to wrap things up, but one last question for you. I'm wondering, do you have any rituals or hacks or practices? Is there like a typical routine you have? Some people do gratitude journaling and cold plunging. Like, what are you doing?
Great question. Actually, you'd asked me that earlier. I'm sorry I didn't answer you in terms of my daily routine, but I typically, I don't know if I have a go-to other than, again, being plant-based in my nutrition, but also strength training. I mean, and probably a lot of your listeners are already into strength training, so I'm sort of preaching to the choir, but it's just fascinating to me as I've sort of evolved on a personal level over my life, where I got in for whatever reason. I don't know, maybe it was overcompensation because I was a really skinny kid growing up, and, looking at, people like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Lou Ferrigno and being fascinated with their size. And so I got into lifting. My body responded to it, and I just loved it. But, I think, like, especially for the women in your audience, a lot of times, as women are, they're kind of afraid of lifting. They think they're going to become masculine or any of this thing that just, unless you're taking drugs, the average woman doesn't have to worry about that. But for me, like, strength training is just who I am. I just love the feeling that I get from a good strength training session. And so that's my go-to. I mean, anything else I do, I might walk around the neighborhood with my family or something. That's not really part of my exercise training. That's just enjoying some activity. But the other thing that I do in supplementing my weight training is I like to sprint, although I've had a little bit of a tight hamstring the last few weeks. So I haven't sprinted in about a month, but I do like to go sprinting when my hamstring is not flaring up, like once a week, to supplement my weight training. But man, I just love weight training. And for me, that's really my go-to, along with, again, a plant-based diet and taking my supplements and then drinking plenty of water every day. I mean, we didn't even talk about, sleep. Obviously, sleep's very important. I've never smoked a day in my life. I haven't had any alcohol in, I think drink of alcohol I had was maybe 11, 12 years ago. I never really cared for the taste of it anyway. I never was much of a drinker, but just trying to be a model for people as much as I can, with again, without sounding arrogant about it, but living who I claim to be, and not telling the world I'm one thing and then sitting around my butt all day and eating at Taco Bell and McDonald's. I mean, I'd be the biggest hypocrite in the world if that was the kind of person that I was. So for me, it's very important to actually live what I say that I'm doing and that I espouse to other people to do. I think that's very important. And likewise, if you saw me lecture somewhere and I looked like I couldn't walk across the stage without falling over from a heart attack, who would take me seriously? I mean, face validity is so important. If you don't look like you're healthy and you're talking about health, who's going to care about what your opinion is? No one.
Yeah, well said. Well said, brother. Man, last but not least, Dr. John E. Lewis, tell us where we can find you, learn more about your work, your supplements, and everything you guys are doing.
Thank you, Joel. So the best source of information for all the work that we've done and looking at daily brain care, making a choice there, would be at drlewisnutrition.com. That's DR with no period, Lewis, Lewis, nutrition.com. You can find daily brain care on Amazon as well, those of you that like shopping on Amazon. We have it in powder and capsules. We have other formulations that we're working on that we will launch over time. But daily brain care is really our focus right now. It's just, and even though it's a marketing term, I mean, it's not necessarily scientific, meaning that the product could have been named anything and it would still work. Daily heart care, daily liver care, whatever. But with the work that we published in brain-related issues, combined with the need for people today with a brain-related issue, we felt like focusing on brain health was so important. So again, drlewisnutrition.com is your best source of information about me and all the science and my work and the products.
That's amazing. Dr. John, thank you so much for being on the show. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Joe, for having me. I really enjoyed it.